Intro. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AAS YouTube channel. And this is going down the Scientific Editor series. And I'm very happy to have Scientific Editor Manolis Georgoulis with us today. Hey, Manolis.
Hi, Frank. How are you doing?
I am doing well on this 25th of May in Phoenix. So we are still relatively cool for being in Phoenix. And probably in about another week or two, the power switch will get hit and we'll start going up into the 40 plus C temperature ranges. So summer is coming in Phoenix. And where are you at?
Well, I'm sorry I cannot say the same thing for Athens. The summer has arrived over here and it's pretty strong. I would say we have temperatures of up to 35 degrees centigrade at the time.
Whoa.
So yeah, that's why I'm saying it's coming strong already.
Wow.
But I am pretty happy to be joining you today in this discussion. I have seen some other very interesting discussions with scientific editors, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to do it. I think it's important to do these for several reasons. Number one, so people get to know who the scientific editors are, and you know, we all sort of operate under general guidelines and policies, but everybody's got their own take on it a little bit, and it's interesting to hear how that goes. So yeah, I'm happy you're doing one. But before we get into that, let's do some of the fun stuff. Like, what do you like to do for research?
Right. So what am I doing? I started off as a student, a PhD student in solar physics and nonlinear dynamics, trying to make some sense of solar physics phenomena, in particular instabilities such as flares. Coronal mass ejections were slowly coming into play at that time in the mid-90s. So flares were the big part, and things started changing in the second half of the decade, I would say, the 90s, that is. So I started like that, trying to make some sense through theoretical concepts of nonlinear dynamical systems into solar flare physics, and then moved into data. I just put my hand on data, working with solar line of sight and vector magnetograms, and I was absolutely mesmerized by the data and the complexity and all this kind of stuff in there. So I switched toward data analysis, using data from flagship space missions such as initially the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, SOHO, and then moving into other space missions with magnetographs such as HINODE, and lately the Solar Dynamics Observatory and its helioseismic and magnetic imager. Right. So an exciting path overall, and I'm enjoying every bit of it.
Very cool. So I'm just kind of curious how people get into the fields that they get into, because, you know, there's 1,001 things one could do in astronomy. So what attracted you initially to the sun?
Right. So this is kind of an interesting story.
I like stories.
Right. So I was let's say I was an undergrad student in physics. I had always had an eye toward astronomy, astrophysics, the sky, you know, coming from those kind of nerdy school years when, you know, you scan through different booklets and books about astronomy and popular text and stuff like that. So I had this kind of thing. And then when I was studying physics, at some point I got discouraged and I said, well, I'm not going to do it at the end. It's too hard. So anyway, when I was about to get my degree, I thought I would do a 6-month diploma thesis. It was optional at the time. And that was on the large-scale structure of the universe. That was pretty much pen and paper at the time, at least, and literature search and everything. So I did that for 6 months. It went well. I was able to defend my thesis pretty nicely. And then the professor in charge, Professor Papadopoulos at the University of Thessaloniki, said, well, listen, why don't you stay around and do a PhD in cosmology? That was and is a big topic. And I said that, well, I could do that because I loved it, every bit of it, but it was not kind of applied science. It was totally theoretical. And at that time, I really wanted to put my hands on computers.
Okay.
At that time, Linux was coming out. There were not even graphics at the time, and people who were trying to do some programming in Fortran and stuff like that loved Linux, and I loved it. I'm still working with it, by the way. So I said I want to put my hands on a computer and work with data, if I can. And that's how I was introduced into solar physics. Another professor at the University of Thessaloniki, a close colleague up until today, Professor Lucas Vlachos, accepted me, and I'm still grateful to him about that. And we started working on trying to use nonlinear dynamics into the analysis of solar events. And this is how it pretty much started. And then the data came and everything else.
Very cool. Very cool. It's been a long, fruitful journey then.
I think so. That's kind of an adventure. It takes a lot of time, effort. It has a personal cost in several cases, but it's exciting.
Cool. It? Nice. Nice. So speaking of history a little bit, what was your very first APJ-AJ article?
Oh, I love this question. That was a 1996 Astrophysical Journal Letters paper that was dealing with interpreting flares via self-organized criticality. Self-organized criticality, if you have heard about the topic, that was a bestseller kind of hit topic in the late 80s. And there was a lot of development in the 90s. So there were a couple of papers by a University of Hawaii team on solar flares and self-organized criticality in 1991, 1993. And then it was us in Thessaloniki. We started working on this topic, and we came up with an initial paper here in Europe. And then the second paper of mine was one at APJ Letters, discussing the topic and trying to make some sense of the statistical properties of solar flares as per the predictions of self-organized criticality concept.
Very nice, very nice. Very good.
Still one of my highly cited papers, I would say.
Well, in part because it's been around the longest, so it has, you know, it builds up. But very cool. So we'll put a link to that to that articles in the description below the video. If you haven't read it already, you can check it out. So since then, so since your first and second publications, what's been your history with the AAS Journal since then?
It's a venue where I published most frequently. I guess this there is a page charge involved, of course, but it was by far my venue of preference, because just after I completed my PhD thesis, I moved to the US. I spent almost a decade at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab in Laurel, Maryland.
Okay.
So we were publishing heavily into AAS Journals back then. And I kind of continued this trend when I came back to Europe.
So after 10 years in the States, then you went back to Greece?
That's right. That's right. 9.5 years, more or less. So almost a decade. I got back to Greece. I spent about 10 years in Greece, and then up until recently, up until summer of 2020. So in the midst of the pandemic, I was in the US again, accepting a visiting professorship at Georgia State University for a couple of academic years.
Ah, okay.
So we were trying to make some, meaningful work over there, putting some projects on rails. So I enjoyed that period of my life as well.
A little Southern hospitality.
Indeed.
So at some point in this trajectory, you became a scientific editor. So I actually have two questions there. So one, when did you become a scientific editor? And perhaps even more importantly, why did you become a scientific editor?
Right. So the whole thing started a bit more than a year ago. So I was in the US, in Atlanta. And then at, I would say, February of 2020, I got an email by Ethan, the editor-in-chief. And he said that, listen, we have received some suggestions that one of the members of the editorial team was about to step down. So he said, we have received some suggestions about you. And I was honored, profoundly honored and thrilled at the same time, because I am kind of, very warmly into this community service type of thing, in the sense that I am reviewing papers. I like to be involved into reviewing. Well, I can not brag, but at least I can proudly say that I have reviewed more papers than I have published. So
very good. That says one of two things. Either one doesn't publish very much.
So Ethan's question kind of came into a fertile ground, and I thought about that, and then I accepted it, and we did the paperwork. I applied, and the positive answer came out in late March 2020. So ever since, I have started working.
Very cool. So you've been a scientific editor for a little over a year now.
Right.
Very good. And I imagine most of the submissions you handle come down the Leon's solar physics corridor.
Indeed. So I'm mostly working with Leon, but also with Fred from Abject Letters, and Chris as well. Every now and then they're sending some papers my way, some manuscripts my way.
Now that I think about it, I occasionally get one coming down the branded as fundamental physics corridor coming down. I should consider you as a scientific editor, because they deal with the sun. They're dealing with solar phenomena. Yeah. So I learned something. Great. So let me just ask you in a really broad sense, what does a scientific editor do?
Well, in essence, I have learned a lot, because that was the first time of me doing this kind of work. So I have learned a lot. Initially, I started, I tried to, in as much detail as I could, read all the manuscripts that came my way. But soon enough, I realized that the key role of a science editor is not necessarily to read a manuscript like as if he or she is a reviewer of the manuscript, but to help the manuscript appeal to as wide scientific audience as possible, and help the manuscript showcase what it has to show. So help it highlight its most positive, important, potentially groundbreaking elements for the community to see.
Cool. Very cool. Yep.
So the idea is that you're just trying to see whether everything makes sense. At least in my mind, that's how I'm trying to do it. When everything makes sense, when you see something that is worthy of being presented, and something that kind of aligns with the overall idea and picture the community has of the AAS journals, right? I mean, this is no simple matter in my mind. It started, I mean, the AAS journal started in the 19th century. So that's why I feel this kind of privilege serving the journals. And at least in my field, solar physics, you have some of the landmark papers, such as papers by George Ellery Hale at the beginning of the previous century, actually,
Right.
have largely shaped the field. And now I found myself, trying to serve and help out these journals, take out the best of research out there and publish it. So
Cool.
that's a big deal.
Cool. Yes, it's an honor and a privilege.
Yeah.
On average, roughly, how many new manuscripts do you handle roughly per week?
Per week. So I would say a few, typically less than 10, but sometimes it has even reached that number. I don't know what's your experience, if it is a lot or.
Let's see. So I've been doing this, God, I don't think, 12 years now, 12 coming up to 13. I originally started out getting about 3 per week, and that ramped up pretty quick to about 5 per week. And currently, at least for the last year and a half, I've been running roughly about 10 per week, new ones. In part because the growth in the high energy phenomena and fundamental physics corridor, there's definitely been some growth. The cosmology corridor still has the largest number of papers coming down, but the high energy and fundamental physics corridor is approaching. It's getting close. So we're definitely seeing an uptick in the number of papers. So my average weekly load is a little higher than most. Let's put it that way. But I largely agree with what you said about the manuscript. I do go over the manuscripts, particularly when I'm choosing a referee, for example. For me, that's the most time-intensive part, is when a new manuscript comes in. So going through the manuscript at a high level. I'm not checking spelling, that's for sure. But as you mentioned, I'm looking for what that message is, right? How am I going to help bring this message out? And then a fair bit of time is spent actually selecting the referee. So typically I will choose about 5 per manuscript before I ever get going. And that's because when you send it out, you never know who has the time to do it, who's available, who may already have another manuscript, etc. So I tend to load the pipe, so to speak, beforehand, and then I start going. And so the rest of it I find relatively smooth, but most of that other than the problem ones, but most in a normal paper, most of my time is invested up front in securing potential reviewers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's kind of similar in my case as well. I tend to select like 3 or 4 reviewers. Sometimes, in most cases, I find a willing person out of those 3 or 4. In some cases, I need a bit more. My record is reaching 12 or 13 people before somebody accepted. And that was,
it happens.
Yes, sometimes it happens indeed. But you're right to say that most of the time goes up front when you're trying to, see who would be most relevant to actually review this manuscript. What I am doing also is that something that I like is that when I receive a reviewer's report, and then I'm just, conveying my editorial decision to the authors, I am trying to make some sense of the report as well. So if there is a 1-page or a 2-page or a 3-page report or more, then I like to write down a few lines, just highlighting the most important elements, just getting the essence of the report, as I see it.
Nice. So you sort of summarize, some of the key points maybe in the report. That's nice. That's a nice touch. That's a nice touch. So speaking of that initial manuscript coming in, what do you think are what makes for a good, solid initial submission to the journals?
Brevity.
Okay.
It has to be brief. It has to be. I like the graphics to be as informative and as simple as possible. I am an avid follower, I would say, of Occam's razor. Do not use more than what you need. So in this respect, I think that, you see, I have seen some people, at least some colleagues, thinking that when you submit a manuscript, this is still in kind of a progress, work in progress or something. I don't agree with this. Yeah, I don't agree with this. You send the manuscript out when you think it's ready. When you yourself or your team you do not think it's ready, then it's better not to send it out and keep it until you think it is ready. Be prepared to publish a manuscript as is when you submit it for the first time, because sometimes it might happen like that. So that's what I like. I like manuscripts that are complete in the sense that the authors themselves feel that they are complete and they have done everything to make sure that they are complete. They have a complete narrative and a complete story to say.
Yes, a relatively polished manuscript coming in, right? Yeah, I agree. I've certainly had manuscripts come in that clearly have the telltale marks of being a work in progress, a draft, and it's just not as fun on those processes. So yeah, I like, and of course there's always going to be things that happen during the review process. The reviewer is going to suggest this, they're going to adjust that. So there's, very typically some adjustments, but you're starting off from a solid place as opposed to, drafts and using the process to polish the manuscript. That's no good.
Right. Let me give you an example. If you have some manuscripts, quite a few actually, that are first submitted to the letters, to the Astrophysical Journal letters, and they get rejected from there, and they send them over to the core, the Astrophysical Journal, right? And then you just read the first sentence in the abstract that says, in this letter, we do this and that, right? So you get the idea right away that the author should make a little bit of more work.
Yeah.
You get this kind of, orange, or not red light, but orange light, that something, needs to be worked a little bit more into that manuscript.
One of my favorite ones is, a submission will come in, a new submission, and you're going through it, and then down in the acknowledgements, they're already thanking the anonymous reviewer for improving the manuscript. It's like, wait a minute, I haven't even assigned one yet. They're just cutting and pasting boilerplate, so to speak. So speaking of that review process, so come in, you choose the subject matter expert in the topic, and it goes through. And so what tips do you have for authors about the review process, or during the review process, or how to handle the review process?
Right. So I guess what I was doing as an author, and I'm still doing as an author when I submit a manuscript, is that because I think it is complete, and I may be, shown that I am wrong by the reviewer, that's absolutely fair play and part of the story.
Absolutely.
Right? But when you get a list of questions to address and to provide some responses and revisions in the manuscript, try to address these questions and these questions alone, right? Mm-hmm. Again, in the most succinct, in the most not terse, but synoptic, I would say, way of putting things together. make sure that the final version of the response to the reviewer agrees with what you have revised in the manuscript.
Mm.
So keep a version control between the manuscript itself and the response to the reviewer, and try not to duplicate parts. I mean, if you have put an entire paragraph in the revision, do not copy and paste this paragraph into the response to the reviewer, because one can see the paragraph in boldface in the manuscript, and in the responses, well, try to summarize this paragraph.
Right.
Try to say, okay, between these such and so lines, or in section such and so, we have put this paragraph that says this.
Mm-hmm.
So focus on precisely on the reviewer's questions and comments, and nothing else. That would be my tip.
And these days, now that we're running the experiment with line numbers, I've noticed that the community seems to have taken to those line numbers pretty well. I will often get reports that, okay, line here and here. And so it's very clear what is being called out. And also for authors, okay, we've changed lines, so that helps, along with boldfacing also helps. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm always amused by author replies that are longer than the actual manuscript. Really?
Sometimes it happens, because if you receive,
if you have a short one, yes, I understand it, but yeah.
In one of my manuscripts, I remember 94 comments by 2 reviewers.
Okay.
Well, you can imagine. So sometimes it happens, but even there, given the circumstances, you try to be as brief as possible. Mm-hmm. Now, as to the line numbers, I think they work pretty well in the AAS Journals macros. They correspond to lines. It's not like what you see in other journals, for example, which, a certain line might be at line numbers 55.5. Oh. If not 55.7, in between lines and stuff, because the fonts do not match between the lines and the text and stuff like that. So I think it works pretty well. And if people put down line numbers, then it is helpful, and it corresponds precisely to the point in text that people want to show.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that. I'll share a personal story of mine, which was paper or an article that I had, rephrase this, Frank, or a manuscript that I had submitted, and this would have been in the early 90s, and I was approaching a new topic for me. I didn't have a publication history in it, so I was dipping my toes into a new field, and the initial referee report came back, and it had 93 points to address, and I was like, whoa. So I understand those highly detailed ones. So I eventually I answered the questions, and as you rightly point out, succinctly did, and eventually the manuscript was published. It went 2 iterations. But got it down, and so I got my first paper on that particular topic. But yeah, on occasion you do get the 90+ point.
That's right, and statistically speaking, this calls for a larger number of iterations, but 2 or 3 is the typical one.
Yeah, it depends how complete you are in your reply, right? I mean, if you honestly and succinctly answer 90 questions, okay, fine. Like I said, mine took 2. But yeah, in general, if there's 90, we might be doing 3 or 4 iterations here before we dial it in. So speaking of writing those 90 odd points, or 2 points as the case may be, what tips do you have for referees during the review process? What should they be writing about or not writing about, as the case may be?
Making sure that their review is readable. In the sense that you structure the review, I would be structuring the review in a way that you start with a summary, so that you give the essence of the review. then you move to the major points, and then you move to the minor points. But the summary is not only what you like about the paper, the manuscript, which is fine, you can write what you like, but also, and most importantly, I would say, just summarizing what your points and comments and suggestions are in the following. So just putting 2 or 3 lines in there in which you just give the essence of the major points would be just fine. This is easier for the editor to read because, as you very well know, you have to deal with, a lot of papers on a given day.
Yep.
So you have to be able to get the idea pretty nicely and not, digging into reviews to try to see what the reviewer is trying to say. So structuring, layering, putting things in an as convenient way as possible for the editor to read them would be my tip to the reviewers.
Cool. Very nice. Yep. Yes, agreed. I have a question, random question. We say, or we encourage plain text reports and plain text replies, and I'm curious to hear what your numbers are for how many, what percentage of authors and referees actually submit their reports and replies with PDF only. I'm just curious what your number is. Is that 10%, 90%, somewhere in between?
I would say with reviewers, when I get referee reports, then it's like 90% plain text and then 10% in a PDF.
Okay.
But when authors submit their responses, I would say it's more than 60% PDF,
yeah,
and remaining 40% in plain text, which is fine, by the way. I do not have any problem in particular if I see a PDF response from the authors. It's okay. I have a harder time dealing with PDF reports from the reviewers, particularly if they don't take care of removing their names.
Well, yes, okay. So it's redaction. It's the
from
redaction
from the preferences, but nonetheless, I can work both ways. But this is how it is. There is a clear inverse trend between the reviews and the responses to the reviewers. The first being mostly in plain text, and the second being in PDF mostly.
Okay. Yeah. I've definitely seen an uptick in PDF both ways. So yeah, the only real issue with that is if you have to redact something or something's not appropriate or something like that. But those you can deal with on a one-off kind of basis.
It has happened to me to get back to the reviewer and say, listen, you're going to have to change that because I don't think it qualifies to be sent to the authors because of such and so reasons. Yeah,
it does happen.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's see. Is there anything else you'd like to share about the peer review process? And that could include, statistical stuff, since you do a lot of that. Data stuff, managing editor stuff about the peer review process, appeals, whatever you like to talk about.
Yes. So it's, I like the fact that we now have comments by our data editors. Mm-hmm. This is really nice because manuscripts, as we both know pretty well, have become now quite a bit more complicated than they used to be. There are supplementary materials in terms of tables, in terms of movies. Yeah. So it's certainly nice to have somebody keeping an eye on this process so that things work in this respect. I like the fact that we have the statistical editor. I think Eric is doing a fantastic job in terms of statistics. And we are seeing also a pretty significant uptick in machine and deep learning papers into the field of physics. I think that's probably one of the ways why I was invited by Ethan to apply for a scientific editor's position, because this is what I'm trying to do over the past several years as well. you see, it's, as I said, my career, as I see it, goes into different levels. So in recent years, I have a keen interest on space weather forecasting. By show the solar eruptive events and how they affect the heliosphere. And this is a clearly interdisciplinary effort. So you are seeing statisticians, you're seeing data miners, you're seeing computer scientists coming into the field. And we're seeing this reflected in the submission of manuscripts. So Eric is doing a fantastic, Eric Fagelson is doing a fantastic job trying to put things together and make sense. Sometimes you have heliophysicists, you know, without prior preparation or study or kind of professional preparation in machine learning and deep learning and stuff, getting a course and then submitting a manuscript, in which case there are issues. And then you get the opposite, namely some data scientists and computer scientists without a proper preparation in solar physics, heliophysics in general, submitting a manuscript and missing the point in terms of physics. So it's a lot of work to be able to do it, but that's part of the appeal. And that's another privilege right there, in my mind at least, which is that we have a vantage point. We are in a vantage point of, you know, getting a first hand, a first eye on the evolution of the field as it comes out. So you see fields evolving, and you are right there to judge whether it is evolving, in your opinion, in the right way or in the wrong way, or you have things to deal with there. It's quite interesting. It's I would say, a plurality of different views, different opinions, different ways coming there. What you are trying to do is try to maintain this being a plurality rather than a cacophony of different things coming in.
Very good. Very good. Yep. Bingo. Right on the money there. Very cool. All right. Well, I would like to wish you a long, happy career as scientific editor for the AAS Journals. Very cool.
Thank you, Frank. I don't know if it's going to be long, but as long as it is, I'm going to enjoy it.
Very cool. Manolis, I want to thank you so much for spending some time today and chatting with us about your scientific editor duties for the AAS Journals.
Thank you, Frank. It has been a pleasure, and thank you so much for the invitation.
All righty. Bye, everyone. We'll see you on the next one.